Fowler's Ghost. This is an odd one, and I put it low on the list only because this was an experimental locomotive. And some people have called me out on this, saying that, is it fair to include experiments on these lists? Because they're experiments, you know. Sometimes during experimentation, you get things wrong, and that's how you learn. And you're right. It doesn't mean the locomotive was good, though. Like, all the experiments that I've talked about on these lists were inherently flawed. They're giving me leeway to talk about it. And let's be fair, we all like to hear a good experiment story. It's fun. Fowler's Ghost is actually a nickname given to an experimental fireless 240 steam locomotive. It was designed by John Fowler and built in 1861. So this was a fairly early steam locomotive. Now, John Fowler was a respected structural and mechanical engineer. He was good at what he did, and the reason why this locomotive is called Fowler's Ghost is that he was kind of ashamed of it. Why was that? Well, it was just a disaster. And I already mentioned this thing was supposed to be fireless, which sounds really weird for a steam locomotive. After all, how can you create steam without a source of heat? Well, it did have a source of heat. Instead of an open flame, this locomotive used fire bricks for the heat, which are usually made of a ceramic material that can retain a tremendous amount of heat for their size. Now, the engine worked on a twofold mechanism. There were the fire bricks, yes, but a big part of this locomotive was the idea of reusing condensed steam instead of just releasing it like a conventional locomotive would. Such a system was ambitious, but it was just a bit too overly complicated. Fowler's Ghost also had one major design flaw that almost led to a steam explosion. During one of its 2 trial runs, the boiler feed pumps jammed, which caused the boiler to run low on water. You may recognize this as very dangerous. We've talked about steam explosions in the past. But the problem was, the Fowler was designed in such a way where it couldn't actually get rid of the source of the heat. On a conventional locomotive, in an emergency situation where the crew is aware of the possibility of an explosion, they can always drop the fire out of the locomotive onto the tracks. The fire would simply burn out on the tracks and not cause a problem for anything, while the steam engine was able to cool down while they sorted out why they couldn't get water into the boiler. But the Fowler actually had no way to do this. The bricks were too hot to remove by hand, and there was no way to get them out of the locomotive. So the crew was terrified the thing was going to blow up. Fortunately, that did not occur, but this issue, combined with the fact that it never really steamed very well, showed that it was flawed to the point of really no saving it. Originally, they planned on rebuilding it into a conventional locomotive, and it probably would have been fine like that, but ultimately it was scrapped. Fowler actually denied its existence for years, but don't feel too bad for him. Sir John Fowler did wind up designing another set of locomotives later, 440 tank engines, that were known as the A-Class, and after updates, the B-Class, and were actually incredibly successful. They were very good in their day, so he definitely made up for his ghost's embarrassment in the end. The Soviet locomotive class OR-23 was a 210-4 locomotive produced in 1949. Now, you may look at it and think, well, that looks very Russian, but what's so weird about it? Looks fine. Look a little bit closer. You see something odd? Yep, that's looking pretty weird. Okay, explanation. This was another experimental locomotive that was designed to operate its pistons in a very bizarre way. Instead of the normal setup, where the pistons would be either to the left or sometimes to the right of the locomotive's driving wheels, these ones were over top. And through a relatively complicated system, actually operated 2 sets of rods that worked the wheels in one direction in tandem. Why would they want to do this? Well, the idea was to reduce hammer blow. It's a vertical force which alternately adds to and subtracts from the locomotive's weight on a wheel. Some of you may know this as dynamic augment, which is what we call it in America. But either way, it's the same thing. And all conventional steam locomotives have the effect to a certain degree. If it's bad enough, it can damage the locomotive or the track, and any development of any steam locomotive has to take it into account. The thought process was that this would balance the driving forces on the wheels, making the counterweights a bit smaller and reduce hammer blow overall. The problem was that it just didn't work. It was too complicated for its own good. Anything they may have gained from restricting hammer blow wasn't worth it for all the other mechanical problems the machine had. It's an interesting idea, I give it that, definitely unique, but ultimately it was for naught, and the locomotive was ultimately scrapped. The General Electric P30CH, sometimes called the Pooch, because of the way the numbers read out. If you look at that in leet speak, it looks like Pooch. So I'm going to call it Pooch, because P30CH is kind of a mouthful. Now, from the get-go, I actually kind of like these things because they're so just square. Like, they're literally a diesel you'd make out of Minecraft blocks, you know what I mean? Or Legos or something. Like, it's just so cubey. But it's distinctive, instantly recognizable as a result. And they were produced specifically for Amtrak, built between 1976 and 1977. Only 25 were ever made for Amtrak, and to be fair, at first they were actually very good. General Electric diagnosed and corrected a lot of the early problems that the model faced, which were basically down to growing pains. Like, that happens. There's some minor defects that sometimes occurs whenever a new locomotive is introduced. That's totally normal. The problem was that after a few months of service, they began to reveal their actual problems. Many of their parts and mechanical features just couldn't hold up over time. They suffered crankshaft failures, traction motor malfunctions, bad axle configurations, which resulted in uneven weight distribution, so that's great. And the dynamic brakes actually had serious response issues, which is horrifying, actually. That was not a thing you would want, ever. They served for a little over 10 years, but by 1992 they were ultimately scrapped. And they were often reassigned to smaller commuter service, which is the opposite of what they were meant for. They were supposed to be for long-distance trains, being replaced by, and we've mentioned these before, the EMD F40PH, which, as I've mentioned, were only supposed to be for short commuter trains, yet turned out to be incredible at pretty much everything they were assigned to do. They were good diesels, and yes, the Pooch was one of the 2 diesels that it wound up picking up the slack for, the other one being the SDP40F, which I've mentioned on a previous list. British Rail Class 141. You know, they say the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result. And I keep making these lists, expecting you to not appear. And every time, I am made a fool. It's a terrible fact. Fact of life. Now you may look at these and think, wait a minute. Are you cheating, History in the Dark? This is a pacer! And yes, you're right, you got me. Technically speaking, you could argue that I've already talked about this locomotive, because in my very, very first episode of this series, that was actually never meant to go past the first one, but here we are, I spoke about the sweeping term pacer trains, which refers to a family of multiple British Rail classes. The 140s, the 141, 142, 143, and 144 are all the pacers, diesel multiple unit rail buses. Therefore, you could argue that I've already discussed this. However, you don't understand. This one deserves a very, very special place, its own topic to go into, because it is unique among the pacers. First of all, this is the first one that was mass-produced. The OG, the Alpha, the Omega, the one that sired them all. Actually, that technically would go to the 140, which was the original prototype for the Pacers, but only one of those were ever made, and believe it or not, the prototype is actually better than the mass-produced 141. So, I'm gonna give the 140 a pass, because the 141's problems were, well, okay, here's the deal with the 141. Remember how I even admitted it in the first part, and some people have mentioned this to me, how I'm not being fair to the Pacers, because, yeah, they're a pain to ride on, nobody likes them, they're uncomfortable, noisy, blah, 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 I get it, but you're right when you say that they were created to fix a major problem that British Rail was suffering from, and that was finances. They needed to keep these branch lines open, but they couldn't do it with a more expensive locomotive. The Pacers were meant to be a stopgap to keep the trains running while they figured out a more permanent solution. It lasted way longer than that, but the 141 is kind of an exception to that excuse. Why do I say this? Well, okay, A, they were uncomfortable. Nobody liked them, blah, blah, blah. You know that about Pacers already. But what you don't know is that one of the major issues with the 141 in particular is that it wasn't cheap. At least not nearly as cheap as they were hoping it would be. See, when the 140 was put through trials, a lot of flaws that they knew they had to fix were realized. And that makes sense. It was a prototype, so of course they're going to figure out that there's these problems. But when they analyzed the cost of actually mass-producing the 140s, as ultimately what the 141s would be, they discovered something alarming, that the cost-saving measures that they initially put into the 140 were no longer there. The 141 wasn't very cheap to produce at all. So it wasn't even doing the one thing that Pacers were good at, and that was saving British Rail money. There's a reason why they only produced 20 of these things, whereas the Pacer's immediate follow-up, the 142, had a total of 96 units produced. In fact, I double-checked just to make sure, and every single Pacer that isn't the 141 or the 140, which was the prototype and that only produced one of those, that doesn't count, every single mass-produced Pacer had more of it produced than the 141, because the 141 wasn't doing the one thing Pacers were supposed to do, and that was save money. So, I think it kind of deserves a very special spot here for being not just a Pacer train. Come on, 141, you guys had one job, I'm just saying. The Lartigue Monorail. Okay. In fairness, this was a very early idea, and some people suggested I put monorails in general on this list, and I don't feel like that's necessarily right. They have a place, especially modern ones. The technology has evolved quite a bit, and while you can't use them on necessarily a very large scale, for regional services or amusement park rides, because Lord knows almost every amusement park has at least one of them, they're not bad. It's just that utilizing a monorail setup, which, as the name implies, has one rail as opposed to the usual two, comes with its inherent flaws. I mean, yeah, it has the potential to be faster, the balancing is worked out, and you have to pay less for infrastructure since you're only putting down one rail, but Lartigue's monorail is a bit unique. And I don't want to come down on him too hard. He was a French engineer. He was a creative guy with a million ideas in his head, as an engineer tends to be, and he was trying to do something distinctive with the technology. So I don't want to come down on him personally, but okay, here's the issue with this thing. First of all, it defeats the purpose of a monorail, which is to be A, faster, B, more cost-effective. You may think it looks really bizarre, because it is. And the reason for that is that the way this works is that there's actually two boilers and two fireboxes. The idea was to even out the weight. So instead of balancing a single boiler in the middle of a single rail, you'd have two that even each other out. And it's actually a pretty intelligent idea to work with here. But the thing about monorails is that, first of all, you have to worry about that balancing thing. That's always a concern, especially with smaller monorails like this one, where those rails aren't any bigger than a normal rail would be. And to his credit, one of his railways, which was set up in Ireland, did run for 26 years, but it was really only ever a novelty, because these aren't even true monorails. If you notice, there are actually two rails near the bottom. Those aren't there for support. Well, they are, but not for the struts, for the engine. He could never get it to balance out properly, so sometimes it would lean to one side. The extra rails were there as stopgaps in case it leaned too far. So it wasn't even really a monorail, since he had to put 3 rails on it to make it work. The other issue is that his monorail design was elevated. You couldn't put proper crossings on these like with a conventional railway. For a road to cross, you had to set up some kind of drawbridge scenario and required an attendant to operate it. It was way more impractical in that regard, which kind of defeated the purpose of simplifying the railway, don't you think? And again, I don't want to sneer at it from his effort. It's clear that Lartigue was just trying something unique, and it is, don't get me wrong. But as a competent train setup that could be used on a massive scale, it was just never gonna work. But to a degree, Lartigue's legacy lives on. In 2003, the Lartigue Monorailway Restoration Committee actually opened a 1-kilometer section of Lartigue Monorail on the trackbed of the former North Kerry line in Listowel. As a museum curiosity, it's actually quite neat, and they managed to build a replica of the original locomotive Lartigue used, although this is only designed to look like a steam engine. It's actually a diesel in disguise. But I think that's cool, keeping history alive, because while the design is inherently flawed, I do think it's actually kind of neat to look at. And to be honest, that's kind of why I do these lists. It isn't just to tear things apart and make everyone feel bad for experiments or things like that. I just want to open up history and look at the missteps or the more unique takes on railway design. Yeah, a lot of them could be called bad, doesn't mean they aren't neat, you know what I mean? Yes, you too, British Rail. Lord knows I would not be where I am if not for the meme involving you. Till next time, this is Darkness, and I bid you all a fond farewell.